Basic literary terms. The basic lit terms quiz will cover the following terms. I'm going to group these into categories in this particular video, and then I'll also provide a link in the description to one of my favorite videos that goes more in depth into explaining the different points of view. Let's begin with character. So a character is a person within the literary work, whether that's a short story, a poem, or a play. Generally speaking, we have a protagonist and an antagonist. The protagonist is usually the main character, but not necessarily. The hero of the story is often also the protagonist, but the protagonist does not have to be a hero to be the main character. The antagonist is a character, or occasionally characters, who in some way oppose the protagonist. That doesn't necessarily have to be the typical hero and villain dynamic, but if you have a hero and a villain, usually one is the protagonist while the other is the antagonist. We can also describe characters as either static or dynamic. A dynamic character is one that experiences a significant change, growth, or development over the course of the work. Usually, this is our main character, and that's part of what makes the story interesting. Static characters, on the other hand, do not change, grow, or develop over the course of the story. There are usually more static characters in a story or a literary work than there are dynamic characters in that same work. Next up, let's talk about plot. The plot is essentially what happens in that literary work. And the most common way to describe or to map out the typical plot of a literary work is Freytag's pyramid. And odds are pretty good that if you studied Shakespeare in high school, you've probably seen this before. You begin generally with exposition from the author. This is the background information. It establishes the who, what, when, where, and why. And then there's some kind of conflict, a conflict between the protagonist and antagonist, a conflict between what the main character expected and what really happened, or what the main character originally thought and felt, and something that changes him or her to question what they thought or felt. Then action begins to rise. Things start to get more intense until we reach the climax. This is kind of the point of no return. From this climactic moment, everything starts to fall into place. All of the consequences of the actions start to happen. And then we end with the resolution, the denouement. We get and so everyone lived happily ever after, or here's how the tragedy ends. Usually when we are missing one or more of these elements, it feels very disconcerting to the audience. The jumbling up of these elements, putting them in different order, can leave the audience feeling kind of confused or even overwhelmed. And sometimes that is a conscious choice of the author, because the author is trying to get those feelings across to the audience. So that's the basic of plot. Next up, let's talk about setting. Plot is what happens. Setting is where and also when it happens. So the where, we're talking from general to specific. Geographically, where is it? So like what country, what state, what town? Is it city? Is it country? Is it urban? Is it suburban? Is it rural? And then also where, more specifically, at what location is this taking place? Are we in a home? Are we in a barn? Are we in one particular room or a prison cell? Where is this action taking place? And we can have multiple settings within the same literary work. Then we also have the when for the literary work, and this includes the broader sense of historical time. Is this in the past, the present, the future? Is it unclear? The season, are we talking about fall or are we talking about spring? And the time of day, is it day, is it night? And so all of these elements combine to give us a sense of the setting, both where and when. Next up, we have symbol. A symbol is something that represents someone or something other than itself. And symbols can be things that are universal, that are across one or more cultures, like red is a color often associated with passion or danger. A red rose specifically is used to represent love. A dove is used to represent peace. So those can be kind of universal or widely known symbols, or they can be symbols that are specific to a particular work. For example, if you're taking Mrs. Bradley's English 102 class, then you've read the short story Mirror Image, and the mirror could be a symbol in that work. And we can also talk about symbolic acts, actions within the story that represent something bigger than just the thing that that character is doing. So, for example, when Alice writes her name in concrete, that is a symbolic action. That is a symbol of her, accepting her identity. So, if you haven't read that story, highly recommend checking it out. It's a short story called Mirror Image by Lena Coakley. Next up, let's talk about point of view. A story, a literary work, a novel, sometimes even a poem or a play, depending. These can be are told from a specific point of view. We have for example, in a short story, we generally have a narrator. So let's talk about the most common types of point of view and what to look for. In first person point of view, the narrator is telling the story using pronouns such as I, me, my, or maybe even the plural form, though it's less common, we, us, our. More importantly, more specifically, the first person narrator knows the thoughts and feelings of that one character. So that character is also narrating the story to us, and we know that through the use of those first person pronouns in the narration, not the dialogue. Next up, we have a third person omniscient narrator. The third person omniscient narrator is going to use pronouns such as he, she, or they, but the difference here is not just in the pronouns, it's also in what the narrator knows. An omniscient narrator knows the thoughts and feelings of multiple characters, more than just one person, which kind of segues into the third person limited point of view. A third person limited narrator is still using the pronouns he, she, they, but this limited narrator only knows the thoughts and feelings of one character. The narrator is not that character. That would be first person. But the narrator is limited to the thoughts and feelings of that one character. And then finally, we have third person dramatic or third person objective point of view. The narrator is still using pronouns such as he, she, and they, but this narrator gives us no insight into the thoughts and feelings of any characters. It's almost like reading a transcript of hidden camera footage. We know what people do and we know what people say, but that's it. The narrator doesn't give us any introspection, doesn't give us any motivation, only shows us what can be observed. Moving on, let's talk about some other interesting narrative choices. These will also be on your quiz if you're in Miss Bradley's class. We have stream of consciousness. If the writer chooses to give this work to the reader using the stream of consciousness narrative style, we are getting that character's thoughts and feelings completely unfiltered. This can be very overwhelming and disorienting for readers, and this is a technique that modernists and postmodernists like for when they're trying to relay those types of feelings to their audience. Next up, an author might choose to give readers an unreliable narrator. An unreliable narrator is one who, for various reasons, the reader can't really trust or rely on to give the full, unbiased, accurate interpretation of what's going on. And that's the implicit, expected relationship between a narrator and the reader. We expect the narrator to be honest and to accurately tell us what people are thinking and feeling and what they're motivated by and why they do what they do. An unreliable narrator is one that we can't trust to do that for us, and that can have interesting consequences on the way readers interpret a work. And then one form of an unreliable narrator is what's called the innocent eye. The innocent eye narrator isn't purposely misleading, is not trying to intentionally undermine the reader's experience of events. The innocent eye narrator is just not able to give a full and accurate interpretation of events to the audience. So this is something that you'll see, for example, in Flowers for Algernon. It's one of the most famous examples of this. Or to an extent, we have an innocent eye narration choice in To Kill a Mockingbird because the story is told from the perspective of a child who doesn't fully understand many of the events that are unfolding in the town around her. So that concludes this presentation. These are your first literary terms that we're going to use to interpret and analyze and understand the short story unit. If you have any questions, let me know.